Who won the war, Kane? I did. You didn't win a thing, Kane. You only survived. It means the same thing. But there must be more to victory than just survival. Kane nodded to the fallen as he carried her from the temple. Ask them now. Ask me in 100 years.
How y'all doing? About 2013, I made a video, one of my early book review videos, was talking about Karl E. Wagner's Kane series. It's a dark fantasy series, on par with Conan, Elric and Melniboné, Fafhrd and Grey Mouser, that sort of pulpy sword and sorcery stories. Of course, the author never did like the term sword and sorcery, but that's another issue here. But it's a series I reviewed long ago. I read it over 20 years, it was over 20 years ago, and I enjoyed the hell out of it. It stuck with me on a lot of things. But making this video and a couple other things, I'm inspired to reread the series again. And one of the things I wanted to talk about was an unanswered comment. Normally I answered most of my comments on this one, and this one right here I've neglected from 3 years ago, sorry. But I want to make an attempt with this video to sort of answer his questions and talk to you about the character of Kane about all this. But first of all, I became aware of Kane. I noticed my mother having a lot of fantasy sword and sorcery paperbacks when I was a kid. I remember the covers of Bloodstone and Darkness Weave. I don't know how many of the whole series she's got. I never looked to it. My first exposure to Kane, unbeknownst to the depth of this character, was through this anthology series called Savage Heroes: Tales of Magic Fantasy, edited by Michael Perry, but also illustrated by Jim Pitts. And of course, it's a nice little anthology that gives you a good example of sword and sorcery stories of that ilk. For instance, you got C.L. Moore's Jarrell Meets Magic. That's one of the five or six Jarrell stories that C.L. Moore wrote. Wonderful female character in that genre. The Necromancers of Naught, that's from Clark Ashton Smith. That's one of his Zotheek stories. And again, I've been reading this without knowing too much about the worlds that some of these writers have created. Henry Kuttner, the spawn of Dagon. Henry Kuttner is C.L. Moore's husband. And some of these I can't recall. Daphne Castle's Alma Mater, The Song at the Hub of the Garden by Ramsey Campbell, The Thief of Forth, Clifford Ball. I need to read some of these again. It's been a while since I've read. The Burrow Trove by David A. Drake. The Temple of Abomination by Robert E. Howard. That's one of his Cormac McCart stories. Anyone could have chosen a Conan story, but I think at this time Conan was more easily found, so I guess they wanted to choose one of the lesser known stories. Oh, this anthology came out in '75, mind you. And of course, In the Lair of Yssel by Karl E. Wagner. This is the first Kane story I've read. Later I found out this is one of the ending chapters of his novel, Dark Crusade. So you don't need to get this one to add to your collection. If you get Dark Crusade, you will have that chapter as a story in this. But that was the first Kane story I've read. Years later, my great uncle, who got me into the sword and sorcery genre and heroic fantasy and all that, he introduced me to Elric and Conan and all that, and talked to me about Clark Ashton Smith and H.P. Lovecraft related writers at the time. And he mentioned that Science Fiction Book Club, which I was a member at the time, had brought out the 2-book series of the Kane stories. So I got them back when they were at regular price. So it's these 2 books. Gods in Darkness, that covers all the novels. That is Bloodstone, Dark Crusade, and Bloodstone, Dark Crusade, Darkness Weaves. And then you have Midnight Sun, which includes all the Kane short stories written here and there over the years, including a rough draft of a story which will later be revised to a Lionel's Reprise. If you read these 2, you understand how an author can revise his work to more flesh it out and see how the character evolves in that guy's head over time. And also has an essay that talks about Wagner's influences in the creation of Kane, the Once and Future Kane, which I just did a reading in my last video. So you can look up Once and Future Kane by Karl E. Wagner, and that's me reading it. And sorry if I don't sound as he would. I'm not the type of character Wagner is. So I've been meaning to reread these for a while, but what brought me to rereading it now is this. A tabletop role-playing game called Black Sword Hack Ultimate Chaos Edition. This is from Mary Mushman. You can find reviews on this online about how the gameplay is. I've only simply read the book. It's not that thick, it's rules light, and the idea is old school dark fantasy. If you like Conan, Elric, and Hawkmoon, Corum, Fafhrd Grey Mouser, Imaro, all those pulpy, heroic fantasy, sword and sorcery, and all that, with a dark edge to it, this is a role-playing game that focuses on those type of themes. I mean, look on the back of here, that could be Red Sonja, or maybe Joril Jory, maybe Fafhrd and Grey Mouser, respectively, or something else similar. In fact, they have Appendix 4, which is a bibliography in alphabetical order. This is suggestive reading to tell you the type of stories that influences making this game. I have several of these books, not all of them, but it talks about the Joe Abercrombie's First Law and Shattered Seas trilogy. I haven't read any of Joe Abercrombie's, and to be honest, I got a lot on my reading list to add that to it. Three Hearts and Three Lions and The Broken Sword by Paul Anderson. I have The Broken Sword. I have both versions of The Broken Sword because he revised it later on after the first edition. Let's see. Jesse Billington, I haven't read. Michael Chabon, I have an anthology of his that he's edited, but I don't have any of his works. The Gentleman on the Road. I love this. Everything by Robert Howard. Yes, I mean everything. I love how they write that out. And that's true, because even his non-fantasy stories like El Borak, which I reviewed, it just shows how Howard's action scenes and how he tells a story can, without the mystical elements, still hold up. So I definitely suggest reading that as well, on top of the obvious stuff of Conan, Karl, Bran McMorn, Solomon Kane, and all that. Elephant and Corpses by Cameron Hurley. Haven't read that one. Gotrek and Felix Sears by William King. I had several of those books, and then I just sort of stopped. I sold the books. I wish I didn't. But at the time, even though that is a Games Workshop product, those books, the early books, were written in that wonderful pulp sword and sorcery thing at the time. That's what made them entertaining. The Lankmar series by Fritz Leiber. That's Fafhrd and Grey Mouser. The Elric, Hawkmoon, Corum, and Ricochet series by Michael Moorcock. Have all those. Empire of the East series by Fred Saberhagen. I have only known Fred Saberhagen from the famous Swords books, which I've never read any of his work. This Favorite Hero by Jessica Amanda Samuelson. No, I haven't read. Niftaline, because of this and another channel reviewing it, which is All Fantasy is Fiction, which is an offshoot of the Dungeon Dives channel. All Fiction is Fantasy is his offshoot channel talking more of the books that he reads, particularly of horror and sorcery and fantasy and all that. Check that out if you can. All Fantasy is Fiction. And he talks about Niftaline. He has two videos. One, he goes to great lengths to explain this book, and I'm going to do a review on that later on. I got a copy of that, so that's by Michael Shea, or Shea. Wrong by Karl Sherrill. I found it because of this book. I picked up a copy of that and the sequel. It just talks about the first one, so I'll read the second book and see why I didn't add that one here. We Are All Legends by Darrell Schweitzer. Did a review on that. The Dying Earth books by Jack Vance. I did a review on that over a year or so ago. The Kane series by Karl Wagner. Because of that, I decided to make some time and reread the series again. And of course, Book of New Sun by Gene Wolfe. Those are the book recommendations. So there's that. And of course, over the years, I've not only picked up all the stories of the Kane series by Karl Wagner. Not only do I have this, which has everything he's ever written on it, I have 2 copies of this. Why do I have 2 copies? Well, I had to take what I could at the price that they were at. See, before they jacked up the prices, and I'll get to that shortly, I got this one at the Hastings bookstore years ago for $7. Boy, I'm glad I got it when I did. Of course, if you got that, you gotta find a copy of it. And when I tried, they jacked up the prices on it. So I found this one. It was relatively cheaper compared to the rest. So between the two, it was less than $200. So I lucked on that. So I have 2 complete editions of this. And also, I've noticed something. There are 2 different sizes. Because this one's from the Science Fiction Book Club, and I guess they did their printing a bit differently on a smaller scale than this one. This is much bigger. But they're the exact same thing. There's no difference in them, just a larger size one of that. I talked about the anthology where I first read Kane, but I also picked this up. Sorcerer's Apprentice, 1983, issue 17. Why did I pick this up? Because this has the first printing of his short story, Misericord, with these beautiful illustrations by the now great now late, Stephen Fabian. Stephen Fabian died earlier this year around May, if I recall, at age 95. He has a whole legacy of work. I went through his website and showed how you navigate around in one of my earlier videos. But here he did the illustration for Mesericord. This is a story where Kane is a hired assassin for a lady who wants to have the lives of these 4 siblings that's encroaching on her rule a bit. And they also have a coronet which she wants to rule after their demise. She sends her lover, who is a thief but doesn't come back. So she hears about the assassin Kane and finds a way to hire him to go after these siblings and hand her lives. So, and this is a story about how he goes about it. Wonderful, dark, brooding atmosphere of the adventure. You know, the villains are definitely villains, but Kane's even a bigger villain, and we'll get to that in a little bit. So, it's beautifully illustrated. I got it because of that, even though I already have a copy of that. So why am I reviewing the Kane series again when I've already done it before? Well, many of you may not be aware of the Karl Wagner's Kane series, even the one I did from years ago. Other channels have done it, but this may be your first introduction to it, for all I know. But this actually, the idea for this video originally was from a comment on my first Kane video 3 years ago, who read the short story Raven's Eerie, and he gave his thoughts on that. And there was something he did not like about the character Kane and what he did in that story, that in order to, of what his thoughts on that. So I want to take this opportunity to answer that comment. Instead of writing it out, I'll answer it here. I've been meaning to get around to it, but other things went through. So sorry about the wait there. But of course, after Black Sword Hack, which inspired me to reread the series again, I want to take this opportunity to review the books and all that, talk about Kane, and through describing Kane, we'll answer this person's question here. So what makes Kane unique compared to Conan and Elric and Fafhrd Grey Mouser? And why does his stories rank on the top, on par with them, compared to all the others stories that came out from the 50s, 60s on up through the 90s of the sword and sorcery heroic fantasy genre? Well, I say heroic fantasy, but the thing is, Kane is anything but heroic. His physical description is a man who's 6 feet tall, 300 pounds of pure muscle, and despite all that, he's very fast and dexterous. His bright red hair, and a short beard, also red. His eyes make a lot of people uneasy. They're described as very pale, piercing eyes that when people look upon it, they think of a killer. They see the eyes of a killer, of a savage and all that. And Kane can be a savage. But later they realize that his eyes are the famous mark of Cain. This character was derived from the biblical Cain and Abel. Karl Wagner took this character from the Bible and made his own take on this. Let me give you this passage here of Bloodstone, and you'll find out what's unique about him.
How old am I, Terrace? Kane asked suddenly. The question seemed pointless. Outwardly, you look perhaps 10 years my senior, but your manner hints of greater experience. And since you ask so ominously, let me hang another 10 years of infamy on your shoulders. And if I told you that outwardly my body has remained unchanged for more than 10 times the years you ascribe to me? Therese stared at him in disbelief, wondering what game he played with her. The southern land stood along the frontier of mankind's emerging civilization. Here, sorcery was not the familiar force it might be on the greater continents. Therese had heard countless dark tales, but she had little first-hand knowledge of magic, aside from the trivial displays of hedge wizards, and the awesome secrets the priests of Omen were said to guard. You don't look like those gnarled and ancient sorcerers I've heard about, who crouch in their towers for generations, mumbling foul incantations, gluttering their depraved minds with secret and damnable knowledge. Though there is madness in your eyes, I find you human enough. Your blood ran red as any man's that day by the mace wind. Kane's gesture was impatient. He had started to bear something of his soul to her and found her reception indifferent. Your acquaintance with occult powers is limited. I think you'll agree. A man can be immortal, and at times destroying breath cannot wither his physical being. So long as such a man eluded death by violence, he might live to wander through centuries. Watch present become history. History pass into legend. Legend fade beyond the memory of man. Wounded, his body would heal without a scar, endlessly rejuvenated to the state it held at the instant of insane God's curse. Immortality is not deep a curse. What do mortals know? Flesh can heal, but the soul can be scarred. To be doomed to wander through eternity. Branded an outcast, no land to call home, no man to name friend. Whatever he seeks to love, to grasp, slips through his embrace inevitably. Age consumes the bones of his hope, the loneliness. Only memories, cold phantoms to torture his dreams, and a hideous, smothering boredom that creeps more stifling with each decade, as the taste of life's frantic delights and transient interest grows stale and dry upon his spirit. It's a curse that waxes less endurable with each passing year. Imagine, if you can, how infinitely precious any chance to discover new adventure will become to this man. Suicide is not an infrequent surcease to despair, she replied cynically. And suicide would be the ultimate surrender to the malevolent will of the god who damned him, he fiercely proclaimed. Why was this man doomed to such an existence? Therese asked uncertainly, wondering how much credence to give Kane's rambling discourse. But Kane lapsed into reticence, evidently regretted his outburst of emotion. Perhaps I share something of this man's spirit.
So that's the unique aspect of Kane. He is immortal. And his survival is trying to beat the god who gave him this immortality by surviving as long as he can. And he's done very well at that. He's lived for centuries, millennia even. But it has its own toll, as he tells Therese, is that it becomes very unbearable after time. So this leads to him to be a very amoral character. You could create an evil villain, and you could describe him as evil. It's not unfair, but you have to understand how he is evil and how he's a villain. Because his immortality, morality, while helpful for us who are mortals as a social species to try and survive the next day as long as we can, with an immortal character who can't have any attachments to anything, you could come up with religions or philosophies. They will come, they will evolve, they will go. They may not hold water in the long run, as much as the original people who thought of this could. Empires will rise and fall. He cannot, he only has himself. And he survives to beat the god who cursed him. So morality can be helpful for us, but it also be a hinder, because it could be situations where if he maintains a morality, that could ultimately serve his destruction. So he will go back to, I will survive this, even at the sacrifice of the morality and what that may save through it. And it may hurt him, or he may not care. It depends on the situation, day to day, how he feels about this. So that's what makes Kane villainous and unique compared to other characters. We're not following a guy to live up to. We're following adventures of a man that should be uneasy if we are around him and understand him to any extent. Not everybody picks up on this. Some people will see a savage man and talk to him. It's like, wow, he's quite knowledgeable on this compared to his appearances and all that. But it's because he has centuries to learn so. He's not strictly a soldier, unlike Conan. He's learned many skills over the years. He's gone through many adventures. Let me read you a passage of Darkness Weaves to see where all he's been through.
Tell me now, who or what is Kane? Again, the demon laughed. There are many things you may not know of Kane. Even in my world, there are mysteries concerned with Kane that have escaped our wisdom. Even to tell you what we know of him will require far more time than your evocation can hold me here. But while your spell lasts, I should tell you a little of the man you have called forth from the past. I obey your command. Behold now, as I show you but a few tableaux of past moments in Kane's fantastic history. Then light began to form out of the chaos. Wavering images began to take shape before her, tumbling kaleidoscopic patterns of time, flashing in front of her eyes now were frozen instants of the past, brief glimpses of Kane's past life, wrested from eternity by the demon's supernatural powers and projected onto her consciousness. Ephraim saw Kane running through a ruined city, a slim girl dashing at his side. Behind them thundered a dozen vicious-looking bandits, triumph on their faces as they urged their mounts after the fugitives. The city's towers were broken and toppled, its buildings gutted and fire-scarred. Horizons were strangely foreshortened, as if the city were built upon a pinnacle above the plain. The rubble-choked streets gave Kane a short lead over the riders, and as he momentarily escaped their sight, He leaped through a darkened doorway, pulling the girl after him. Kain lay naked across a moldering bed, in a room where moonlight spilled through a window curtained with dusty cobwebs. Beyond the window stretched the crumbling parapets of a fortress that has slumbered in ruin for decades. A deserted village could dimly be seen in the valley below. Kain seemed to give no notice to the decay rampant about him as he lay there, weakly in a dream. Stepping close to him in the musty chamber was a pale-skinned woman, her porcelain figure veiled with rotting silk. The moonlight shone white upon her long fangs as she smiled at the men who awaited her. A gore-spattered Kain reeled, locked in combat with a towering demon of twice its bulk. Doll-sized imps scampered about the thrashing legs of the combatants, stabbing at Kain with tiny razor-edged spears. Several of the imps lay crushed and sundered upon the red earth. Behind him, a naked girl stood bound to a rock, watching the battle in terror. Desolate mountains of black stone ringed the figures, and from the cliffs beside them yawned a black cave that seemed to drop off straight into the bowels of the earth. Kain's sword was broken, and he slashed desperately with the jagged fort. Holding away the demon's jaws was his free arm. Kain slipped stealthily along empty streets in a city where no windows shone a light against the darkness. There were no signs of destruction, but the buildings stood as if deserted for several years. Here, there, the moonlight disclosed a scattering of dry bones. Torches followed behind Kain as half a dozen grim-faced men stalked him through the dead city. The night exploded into a chaos of bloodshed and flame. Kain strode through the pillared streets of a city, sword red in his fist, laughing mightily as his pirate hordes righted them all about him. Barbaric figures smashed down doors of houses, slaying all who confronted them. Howling warriors raced through the streets, loaded down with riches and plunder. Women and children were being cut down alongside their men, and the younger girls were carried off, bare-limbed and screaming, into the darkness. Kain seized a wine bottle from a passing looter and poured its contents over his blood-flecked smile. Kain ran up a long flight of stairs, pursued by a slavering white-furred creature, half man and half wolf. Below them lay a castle hall, its tables overturned and its floors crimson with blood. Strewn about were the torn and broken bodies of scores of men and grey wolves. At the top of the stairway, Kain suddenly turned to hurl himself upon the hulking werewolf. Locked in a bone-crushing embrace, man and werebeast hurtled back down the stairs, bounding through a railing near the bottom and crashing to the hall floor. The stunning impact threw them apart. Kain shook the pain from his head groggily as the werewolf champed its reddened fangs and lunged at him. Stars shone down upon a tower jutting far into the night sky. Wearing robes of a fantastic pattern, Kain hunched in concentration over a table strewn with strange volumes and scrolls of rust-red writing. He was muttering to himself while he worked over pages of diagrams and calculations. Often he referred to the dark tomes of necromantic lore that lay before him. An intricate system of pentagrams and occult glyphics covered much of the tower walls, while a terrified girl wept in chains in one corner. Kain sat upon an immense throne of obsidian. On his head was a crown of unfastened jewels. A snarling lion lay at his feet, causing the couriers who stood beside his throne to keep their distance. Their manner of dress was unfamiliar, nor was their race immediately recognizable. Kain's face was twisted in anger, and his lips formed strange syllables as he made some decree to those assembled before his throne. Consternation shuddered through their ranks at his words, but they slunk away when he leaped up in fury and brandished his scepter as if it were a mace. Shambling man-sized creatures who looked like monstrous hybrids of man and frog stood watching Kain in the shattered chamber of some colossal pre-human structure. Great bronze swords were clutched in webbed fists as they waited in the shadows of the cracked and leaning walls. Slimy waters covered much of the floor. The fleshy vines stole through jagged apertures to enshroud looming machines of unguessable nature. A gigantic crystal filled the center chamber, a sullen dome nearly 100 yards across, composed of a substance that resembled bloodstone. The scarlet veins of the crystal suddenly seemed to glow with life. Blinding flashes of coruscant energy burst from long slumbering pillars of machinery, driving amphibian creatures back in fear. An eerie light of green, veined with red, shot forth from the depths of the awakened crystal and bathed Kain in its fire. Kain stood in what appeared to be a cavern, stretching endlessly far beneath the earth. Jagged stalactites hung like black clouds from the cavern roof a mile above. Above him, the horizon vanished over the smoking plains of shattered rock and angry lava pits. In this nightmare vision of hell, Kain was not alone. Dark creatures of blighted beauty stood around him, bizarre demons with leathery wings and beautiful faces that glowed with evil wisdom. They wheeled about Kane in attitudes half of menace, part curiosity. Kane spoke earnestly to one who seemed to be their leader, a tall demonic figure of perfect beauty and consummate evil, whose eyes shone like yellow suns. Kane rolled on the floor of a fantastic temple, struggling with another man before its smoking altar. Kane's eyes were wild with murder lust as he wrestled there on the stones. His powerful hands were locked about his opponent's throats, who now flailed only weakly at Kane's grinning face. The livid face of a man he strangled bore a striking resemblance to Kane's own primitive features. The pictures flashed through Ethel's mind at a bewildering speed, taking shape, then dissolving almost faster than she could recognize each scene. The demon's grating voice reached her ears through the phantasmagoria, while Ethel sought to comprehend the frozen moments of Kane's incredible saga as they burst from the vault of eternity. 2 centuries? They are nothing to Kane. Years are only flickering moments to a man who has seen ages roll past him. Empires rise and crumble, mankind emerge from infancy, and the elder race pass into darkness. You have badly underestimated Kane, as you can now see, Ethel. He is not, as you suppose, a mere pirate lord who has been kept living past his time by a freak of fate. No, Ethel. Pirate, thief, beggar, king, sorcerer, warrior, scholar, general, poet, assassin. His roles have been myriad. This man who measures centuries like years has been many things in his endless wanderings. For centuries he has wandered from place to place, and wherever he lingers, he brings death and destruction with him. He is a harbinger of death, a lord of chaos. To tear down, to kill and destroy is his very nature. For was it not Kane who first introduced murder to a newborn race? This Kane, Ethel, is a man who have chosen to league himself with. But no man can live for centuries and remain altogether human. His mind is filled with the wisdom and experience of centuries. He has seen things of which others can only dream. He has tasted knowledge that would drive sanity from the mind of another man. And he is not sane as your world reckons sanity. Kane's thoughts are not like those of another man, for he sees all things in the perspective of centuries. Lives of others are flashing motes of light. Time stands still for him, and everything you hold to be permanent Kane considers no more than ever-changing phenomena. All that remains permanent for Kane is his own existence, and to make this interminable existence endurable is all that drives him on. His motives are unguessable, his actions unthinkable to human minds, for he lives in a world of flux in which he himself is the only stationary force.
So another aspect of his Kane's immortality is allowing him time to master several skills that a normal mortal could not achieve throughout a single lifetime. So he's more than just a powerful warrior. He is a, well known of history. A lot of it he's lived through. He's also skilled in sorcery. He even has psychic abilities described here and there. It doesn't extend. It never explains to extent of how this psychic abilities work. I remember in Dark Crusade, he looks into a woman's eyes and says, "Tell me everything," and through either magical or psychic abilities, he has her tell him. He also says he has some sort of psychic abilities in Darkness Weaves, but the person he was up against was not. It was obviously more powerful than he was. So he's mastered quite a few and skilled in many others. So that's what makes him much more difficult to deal with if you try to go against him. It's not just that he's a big, powerful man of his martial prowess. He is, his experience, his intellect, his whatever source of ability he keeps a hold, his wits. He's survived centuries. He's survived millennia. He's still here. So while he can still die with enough, if you deal enough damage to him, it would be very difficult to do, and most people just can't do it. And because he's not going to be chivalrous about it, he's not necessarily going to play fair. Whoever he's up against, he will do whatever he can to stop them in order for him to survive. Remember, everything about Kane is at his core survival to beat the god who cursed him with immortality. So morality will not hinder him. he may come to love and befriend many people, but he knows they won't last forever. And there are times where he may have to sacrifice him in order to keep surviving. But in doing so, he's back to what draws him to, the downside of his immortality. In one story, in Cold Light, every once in a while it describes him getting into a deep depression, that he has to isolate himself away from everything until he somewhat recovers from that. And that's just due to the weight of immortality, the burden of that. But he still moves on. He is Kane. He serves himself. He serves no other gods or fool's causes, again, from the story of Cold Light. So he will not give himself up to patron gods or demons or what have you, because he will only rule himself. Because he's only got himself to move on through the centuries. So with that being said about Kane and how and who he is, I'm going to read you the comment that was given to me. Now, before I do, because of YouTube's algorithm, which I don't really try and follow anything, that's why I'm not a very large channel. So whatever numbers there is, at least I don't have a lot of bots. But with that said, we're going, things like SA, as you know, or the word that is described in this video, a lot of channels say to keep up with the algorithm, they will put a G in front of it to make it a different word, but it's the brown paper bag over an alcohol bottle. We know what's in it. So I'm just going to say exactly what it says here. So here we go. This is from Ron Leroy 4468. I enjoyed reading some Kane novels and stories until I read Raven's Eyrie, which destroyed the entire series for me. Rape can be a part of a story set in the grimdark fantasy world, but how this is presented is absolutely crucial. Rape can be a part of a story in order to show the true horrors of war, or something done by a character in order to get the reader to understand exactly what a sadistic coward he is, unworthy of any sympathy whatsoever. If it is something that rape should never be presented as, it's badass and cool, and he puts in quotes. Darth Vader could blow up a planet full of people, but it can still be badass cool villain, even though there is nothing cool about genocidal dictators in the real world. Rape, however, falls in the same category as child molestation, etc., an act only performed by someone that should have no other place in a story than that of the villain that you just want to see get punished. Kane is not presented in that way in this story by Wagner, even though he has raped a woman, and it's just disgusting. Okay, so just so you're understanding the context of what this commenter is talking about, it's the short story Raven's Eyrie. And this story is where Kane is a leader of a group of bandits who have just been attacked. Their numbers are reduced. They're trying to escape from these soldiers that are chasing him down. But Kane is seriously injured, so they need a place to hide out. And he finds this inn. Kane's been here before. Him and his group of bandits years ago went there and set fire to the place. This place is now partially in ruins. They killed the guests. They killed the families who were running that building. The woman who's running it now was assaulted by Kane, while her sister was assaulted by the men. And afterwards, years later, Kane comes back, and there she is. She recognizes him, and in his state, in a recovering state, he recognizes her. But there's more to it than that. You see, the woman who assaulted had a child through that incident. Clest, who, like Kane, has red hair and has blue eyes. So we find out that Kane has a daughter. Here's where you get, here's where it gets another complexity in the story. The woman wants revenge on Kane, and she thinks she's found a way. She has made a deal with a demon lord that after the child was born, she gives the child no love whatsoever. She raises it, but after a certain time to the next demon lord's moon, which is happening at this story, the child can be used as a sacrifice so the demon lord can grant her revenge in killing Kane. So there's another angle Kane has to face here. So the only innocent in this whole story is the young girl Clest, and maybe one of the helpers of the inn there, but who has some love for her, but she won't be able to help Clest at all. So that's the basis of the story. So to answer this commenter, let's talk about Wagner himself. Now when you look at pictures of Wagner, see something like this, more or less. Looks like a biker, doesn't he? Well, he was a heavy drinker. In fact, that led to his demise at the end of his life here due to complications of heart and liver issues due to excessive drinking. But before that, he was an MD. Yeah, in psychiatry. I think, if I recall, he had a history BA, and he went to, he has a master's degree in psychiatry. I think he was working on his PhD if he had done already. There's a documentary called The Last Wolf, Karl Wagner. I've yet to watch it, so I don't know all the details. Some of you may already have. But again, this guy was a medical professional. He worked at a mental institution for a while before he became a writer. And what does he write mostly that he's famous for? Most of it, what he did outside of Kane? Horror. So you got a medical psychiatrist writing horror. It's actually a good combination for that genre. So with that said, he has horror novels, and one of his famous is an anthologies where he edited the best horror fiction around. That's not the full title, but you can look up his entire bibliography. So Kane is a dark fantasy, that has a lot of horror elements, particularly in Gothic literature. And we're talking about the old-fashioned Gothics, the heavy stuff, from the 1700s on, through 1800s and all that. Not the ones from the 60s, which he says in Once a Future Kane that that women in hair salons would read. No, in fact, here's a part of the essay, Once a Future Kane, about that. Now, and then there was the major character of the Gothic novel, the hero/villain. In him, I saw what I wanted. He was the central character, not just a viewpoint character, but the dynamic force who carried the entire novel. Evil, yes, but majestic, powerful. A brooding, haunted figure, doomed and damned, but not about to call it quits. And he was amoral. When he acted, no consideration of good or evil entered into his judgment. The hero villain did as he pleased, acted according to his own interests and desires. If he was a monster, he was a magnificent monster. If he failed, well, he didn't die in bed. That encompasses Kane to a T. So you read that, and read Raven's Eerie, you can see what Karl was doing. Now, the cool badass villain, which is something we do with many villains throughout many genres, particularly in horror and all that. Again, I've done it. I'm sure you've done it. Just think about villains. We do that too, to make them cool and badass. Dracula, for an example. In the book, very little of that is so. It's what we've done with Dracula through other films and other stories throughout the years. But in the original book, there was a scene where in order to stave off his three brides from drinking from Jonathan Harker, he gives them a bag screaming that we find out is a young child in it. Which should be, things that should be, again, on this guy's list of what you don't want to portray. Now, granted, Dracula dies, so it's sort of, we get to see his demise through such actions. Later on in the book, he turns Lucy into a vampire, and what does she do? Well, because of him, she's now a vampire going around drinking from children. So think about all the things we've done with Lucifer. Think about horror movie icons and stuff like that. We kind of give it the badass cool villain here. Again, something we all do. But with Wagner, I think his attempt is saying, this is the wrong way to approach Kane. To be fair, if you read some of the Kane stories, but not all of them, some of them, you can probably come to this guy's conclusion on how you would view him as a cool, badass character. Let's go over to this. Some of the short stories. All right. Mesericord. I mentioned it earlier in my magazine, Sorcerer's Apprentice, where it was first published there. Stephen Fabian illustrations. That's where he's an assassin hired to kill four very twisted individuals, brothers and sisters, in this one keep for this lady that hired him. You read that story, it's like, yeah, that's a cool, badass villain. Let's see. Reflections on the Winter of My Soul. After reading what somebody Kane has already done, and in this story, he's trying to get out of this very harsh, unnaturally harsh blizzard, and find shelter in a castle that takes him in, that's being haunted by a werewolf. Mirage, that's where he confronts a vampire trying to seduce him. Let's see. Cold Light is another great example. Or you could probably see him as a cool, badass villain. Where Kane is being hunted down by a zealous fanatic who wants to eliminate all evil in the world, and he's brought over a group of men to help him out, and Kane's on their next on their list. The Gothic Touch, that's where you got Kane and a crossover of Michael Moorcock's Elric, originally published in Tales of the White Wolf, the anthology where Moorcock has other writers writing his Elric character, in their stories. So here they are, they're kind of Kane wants Elric's help because he needs Stormbringer to help him out in this situation. He can't take Stormbringer. Stormbringer doesn't like him. But you read that and it's easy to understand where Kane is considered a cool, badass villain. But not everything. In Undertow, he's keeping this woman alive who's trying to escape him, trying to seek help. And what does he do? He keeps her trapped and has her, drink these potions to keep, attempt to keep her alive and immortal. So because he loves her and all that, very toxic relationship there. In Bloodstone, one of the novels, where we see Kane with the power of the Bloodstone itself, he goes to one of the two cities that could team up and destroy him. He sends his army of monstrous creatures out, and they're trying to fight him off and everything, and ultimately he takes the power that Bloodstone gives him, and he uses it to destroy the men, women, and children of this. We read about this and have a good visual image. You're not going to view him as a cool badass. He is straight up villain, and he makes it through it at the end. Now, in three set of stories, at first just Ghostly, one of three stories that take place in our world, it could look like that Kane is helping out humanity. And because he's, with the help of his daughter and a guy with special ability that Kane needs, he's stopping the forces that could try and take over our world. It will end up helping us because he kind of states that he's the only way of helping everybody in this situation. But remember, it's also detrimental for him if they take over as well. So don't forget that. So you may think, oh, he's kind of taking on a good guy side for a change. He's changing over the years. Well, and then you read the two other short stories that again take place in our world, Lacune and Deep in the Depths of the Acme Warehouse, and Kane is still Kane. So when you read Kane in full, he's kind of like he's an evil that goes around, because he's trying to survive every day. Because as I said, every day he lives through his immortality is an extra victory against the god who cursed him with it. But and one of the stories I mentioned, at first just Ghostly, he was a necessary evil to help us out in our world against the forces that could do worse to us. But don't make that as a turn that he's a good guy now. No, because the tomorrow is another day, and the century is also another century, where he has to do whatever he can to get through, his through the burdens of immortality. To see Kane as a cool badass villain is, I believe, the author Wagner is trying to say this is the wrong way to look at him. Some of the things you may find cool, but there are other aspects of Kane's facets, so we say, of his personality, of how he is like, you got to be careful, because it can be detrimental to you. If you have to be put in harm's way for his survival, he's not going to, no matter how he feels, that's what he will do to ensure that. He is a villain. We must not forget that. And the thing is, there's probably aspects of that we don't want to see in horror and all that. But remember, when it comes to fiction in whatever medium, we could turn it off. We could put the book down. We could walk away from all that. Real life is worse. When people do this in real life, that's the part where we should really feel disgusted. And we can feel disgusted in fiction, but remember, it's still fiction. No one's truly harmed by it. So, for those who are interested, how are you going to find the Kane series today? You're not going to find them in Barnes & Noble, at least in the physical copies like this. Well, I would definitely suggest to find copies of these. Here is something unfortunate. If you try and find these through secondhand, particularly eBay and all others, they can raise you at, if you're very, very lucky, $150, $300 on average, if not more. Paperbacks of his stories, three of the novels and the three anthologies. If you get all those, you get the entire series. But they can range about, if you're lucky, $30 or more a piece. And not all of them are in perfect condition either. Of course, the better condition are going to jack up the price. So that's a real problem about this. So let me show you what I'm talking about.
Okay, so here we are on eBay, your main source for secondary copies of Kane. But what you see here is more or less what you see in other booksellers at the same time because they're going to compare themselves and they think that's where the price demand is. So let's take a look. This is one of the paperbacks, Death Angel's Shadow, with the Frank Frazetta cover here, 101.24, a little high, but but your average ones are going to be around here. Dark Crusade and one of the novels for 35.66. That's what you're going to find most of your paperbacks. It's pretty pricey, but it used to be only a $5 book, give or take. Night Winds, one of the anthology of Kane stories, $28. Now here you have some signed editions by Wagner himself. Understandable to have a higher price of. Again, pretty understandable. Death Angel's Shadow for $79.80. Now I'm so lucky I got the editions I did of Nightshade books. Look at this one. Midnight Sun for $5.50. Apparently this is let's see, a Karl Wagner, limited edition. Yeah, because they don't print these anymore. So, and this is, you get that in the Gods in Darkness, you have all the Kane stories. So that's why they put that price on high end. But you can still get the paperbacks, for $30 or $40 range. Like Bloodstone for 45, Dark Crusade for 39, special edition Midnight Sun with a slip cover, 597. Signed Midnight Edition here. So these were made in 2000. So this is after Wagner's death, so it was probably signed by somebody else of the publishing company. Again, Dark Crusade for 35 and so forth. Gods in Darkness. This is the same one I have here, but just no dust jacket here for 175. Now this one is close to the second Midnight Sun copy that I have, which was around 150 at 8 books. I got real lucky on that one, but still, maybe this is understandable because it's been out of print for 20 years. But still, if the demand for Kane stories is this high, surely we could find new mass market books, paperback or hardcover, that's more approachable that people can get. We already have that with Robert Howard's Conan. Del Rey, for over 20 years, has made the same 3 books that got all the Conan stories, but with the only reason why we're seeing this right now is that there is no current Karl Wagner Kane stories. The closest thing we have current is the Centipede Press. They make these high-end collector's editions that are pricey to begin with, and of course, you sell in the second hand, $750, and we could see it as high as up to $1,000, for the same books here, and they're beautiful editions. There's a YouTube channel that shows the Centipede Press Kane stories, and you get to look inside. They're beautiful to look at, but wow. But everything else, Death Angel's Shadow, $100 on the high end. But this is what we got with getting physical copies of the of Kane through secondhand market. But if you're just interested in reading it and not caring whether it's physical or digital, well, here we got a second option. If you go to the SF Gateway, Science Fiction Gateway, you go under authors, look up Karl Wagner, and this is how you can get an affordable means of the Kane stories through ebook form. There are 6 ebooks, 3 for the novels. That's Bloodstone, Darkness Weaves, and Dark Crusade. But you also got Night Winds, Death Angel's Shadow, and the Book of Kane, which will have all the short stories. So so these are not physical books. They don't produce those, despite the fact that they're producing other physical copies. But here is the next best thing. If you can skip past the need for physical copies, or you just don't have the money but still want to read it, this is your best thing after that. You get it on Kindle, Apple, Google, Kobo, and ebooks. You can find them in Amazon. You can find them in Barnes and Noble. There, because that's Kindle and all that. But there you go. If you want to read them and not too picky about how and what format they come in, this is the next best thing, and it's quite affordable.
So yeah, it's not impossible for somebody to pick up these stories and read them today. Unfortunately, if it's physical, you gotta bring up the money there, and your best bet is getting them through the 6 paperbacks, in whatever condition they are. Just if you can get around the $30 range, that's too expensive, if you ask me. But again, that's the secondhand market for you. If it is somewhat known, by other people, they mention it, and it's out of print, booksellers would try to up the price on them because it's simply out of print, and they're going to try and work on the demand. But if there is enough people who are willing to pay that price about that, surely we can get physical copies on a print-on-demand basis. If you by any chance or work for a print-on-demand company and look for another book to read, you could probably talk with the SF Gateway, and work with them and the Wagner estates and see if you can print on demand physical copies on demand. Valancourt Books can do it, and they already do that with one Karl Wagner anthology of one of his horror stories, not Kane. But but if it's possible for them to do that, surely it's possible to get his most popular work in physical conditions today. So, with that said, I hope for those who are just watching this and are introduced to Kane the first time, you'll be interested to buy it, your digital or physical. And I hope I answered that commenter's questions to somewhat of a satisfactory degree on how to look at it. Maybe I'll have to go about a different way, or you could probably think of other facets, to look around there to understand where the flaw of the cool badass villain, which is not how Kane should be viewed. But with that being said, thank you all for watching. You have a nice day.